This is a panel I think that's been long overdue. It's quite clear that the defund the police movement has started to sputter, if it ever really meant anything. But that really doesn't mean that the end of reform or police reform is not on. Police reform itself is not on the table. And the purpose of this panel, or one of the purposes, is really to take a look at what's actually happening in the grassroots in law enforcement around the country in terms of changing the approach to policing and in response to suggestions made by both law enforcement, by community activists, and by government. And to take us through it, I'm really honored to have, we're really honored to have Nancy Vigne as our moderator. Nancy is director of the Council on Criminal Justice Task Force on Policing, and she directed the Urban Institute Policy Center and served as executive director for the Charles Colson Task Force on Federal Corrections Reform. So we're more than happy to have Nancy take us through it. She will introduce us to your speakers today. Now we have about an hour and a half to go. So Nancy, over to you.
Thanks, Steve. It's Nancy Vigne, by the way, with the Council on Criminal Justice.
I always get that wrong.
It's okay. And I always correct everybody, not just you. But good morning, everybody. Great to see you all. We are awaiting, hopefully, Lonzo Anderson, Executive Assistant Chief from the Dallas Police Department. But the life of a chief is a busy one, so it's likely that he's been pulled elsewhere for more important issues. So if he joins, that would be excellent. But I'm happy to get started and introduce our other panelists. We have Elsie Scott, who is director of the John W. Waters Leadership and Public Policy Center at Howard University, veteran police officer herself. She can share more about that as she participates in the conversation. I'm not doing bios, y'all. It's too much. And I think that your exceptionalism speaks for itself. And we also have Sheriff Rosie Rivera, who's Sheriff of Salt Lake County, Utah, but she actually wears two hats. She's also the CEO of the Unified Police Department of Greater Salt Lake County. And last but not least, so we have Chuck Wexler, who's the executive director of the Police Executive Research Forum. And again, we're hoping that Chief Anderson from Dallas PD will join us when he is able. So
if I could just butt in very quickly, we do have bios available for those who are interested. Yes. They are located on our website. I'll send around the link in the chat.
Thank you. I meant to mention that, Steve. Thanks for sharing that. And to be clear, these are very distinguished panelists, and it's quite an honor to be facilitating this conversation. Now, when Steve reached out to me about moderating, I had two conditions. One is I wanted to be able to contribute to the conversation as well. My most recent role at the Council of Criminal Justice was heading up its task force on policing, which was a collection of 9 exceptional people, including Sheriff Rivera, who came together to assess the most common policy responses to police reform in the moment, and to look at those responses in the context of what we know from the research evidence, as well as the task force members contributing their own professional expertise and lived experience. So don't blame me if I find ways of weaving in some of those findings in the course of this conversation. And secondly, I asked if I could reframe the question a bit. Rather than talking about defund, although I imagine that might emerge in this conversation, I was thinking, here we have a virtual room full of journalists. And so I wanted to start the conversation off by asking each panelist to share with this audience, there's been so much written about policing and police accountability and police reform, particularly post the death of George Floyd. What are some stories that you feel like have been overlooked or could be explored in more depth? And I'm going to invite Chuck to start first. And then what I'd like to do is really to make this a conversation. So Chuck shares, and then we can react. And then we'll move on to another, rather than just having people speak one after another. So Chuck, what would you like to see journalists cover more in this space?
Well, Actually, Nancy, I'm very upset that you didn't do my entire bio because
It would have taken too long.
I was really kind of prepared to just listen to you talk about me, but since you didn't do that, I just want to say hello to everybody. Hello, Elsie Scott, my good friend from years past. It's great to see you, Elsie, and Steve, and Rosie, and Nancy. You know, I'm sure there's been stories written about this. So, you know, whenever you say, oh, there's no stories about anything, with so many journalists today, it's hard to say. But I think a really interesting story would be to ask police officers what they think about police reform, to go to different police departments and to ride with cops and ask the department, give me your best cops. You know, maybe that's the wrong question. But I think, you know, it'd be interesting to see what a police department thinks are some of their, you know, really well-regarded cops. And then to just do a ride along and to talk and to go to situations, to go to domestic violence calls, to go to calls where people are having mental health issues, to go to potential calls where police have to arrest someone, to go to calls where, you know, someone is just angry and upset. You know, just to kind of talk to cops and be with them as they're dealing with difficult situations, to know what it's like to be videotaped all the time. You know, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? How are body-worn cameras working for you? Were you in favor of them when they came out? How do you feel about them now? Do you think they help your job? Do you think they don't help your job? Tell us about why did you become a cop? Would you recommend policing to your children, to your brothers or your sisters? In other words, kind of, you know, parachute into a police department and kind of get a sense of, you know, those issues, and then ask them, you know, there's a lot of discussion today about reforming the police. How will that impact? How do you think about that? Ask them about the case in Minneapolis last week, where 3 officers were convicted for failing to intervene and render first aid. What do you think about that? What are the implications of that case for you? So my point is, if you want to change American policing, you got to capture the hearts and the minds of the cops. I mean, people think, you know, I've known, you know, a lot of police chiefs who want to reform the police, and you know, there's a lot of things you need to do, but you have to get the cops to believe in you and what you want to do. And so anyhow, that's a much
great.
longer.
Chuck, so what I hear you say is journalists walk in a police officer's shoes for a while. I remember when I did my first ride along, and it was pretty eye-opening, just how officers spend their time and the various issues that they're called to deal with. That it's just very different from what most members of the general public think. But I'm curious to hear from other panelists about this notion, and in particular, maybe it's the research in me, but you know, I wouldn't ask for the best officers. I just want a sample of officers so that I could get a sense of the array of opinions and experiences. And then also hear from others about, like, what do we lose by just doing the ride-alongs? Because I feel like there's a growing literature around the role of the middle manager, right? Like the supervisors. And so Elsie, Rosie, do you have thoughts on that?
I can go first, Elsie. Yeah, I do have some thoughts on that. I think looking at that first line supervisor is so important, because that is the person who is dealing with that crew for that day through the entire shifts. And if they're seeing things, you know, that are not being passed on to the leadership, there's a miss in the communication. But that specific person needs to understand policing, understand. They're actually required to even know more in some cases, because they have to know all their people day to day, what they're going through. And I'll talk about officer wellness in a little bit and why that's so important. but they also have to understand the organization, how it operates and what policies are in place so they can hold officers accountable. If they don't have that clear understanding as a supervisor, it's a failure.
This is Elsie. I just want to correct one thing before I start talking. I'm not a veteran police officer. I'm a civilian. I'm a
I
civilian.
didn't realize that because of the roles you've had. I'm sure I'm not
Right.
the first one to make that error.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time as a civilian working in and with police officers, but I've never been a sworn officer. So I don't want anybody to come back and say she's masquerading as a police officer. I'm sure Chuck can relate to that. But one of the things that Chuck mentioned that I would like to highlight was he mentioned the case in Minneapolis where the officers were convicted for not taking action. And it's very interesting, you know, and I've been sort of torn on this as to whether I felt like they should have been convicted, not looking at, you know, the law and everything, but looking at having spent time as a police trainer, is that you spend a lot of time training officers to intervene, but it's kind of hard to get them to break out of the mold of doing what their training officer in the field, their field training officer has told them to do. You know, because I used to run the New York City Police Academy, a police training program. And one of the things that the officers always said, you know, once we leave the academy, that the field officers tell us something different from what we have been trained here. And so when they're looking at Chauvin, who is their veteran field training officer, you know, should they have been convicted when they were following their training, but not the training that they got officially from the police department. And I know the police chief has testified in the other part of the case about, you know, what is offered in training. As a trainer myself, I agree with that. And this may be a way of catching the attention of police officers in terms of what your role is as, quote, a bystander. And there's a whole group of people that are offering bystander training in police departments. So I think it is necessary that we need to teach them to take action. And this might break this whole chain of people saying, forget everything you learn at the academy. We'll tell you the real deal, because the real deal has you going to prison.
Right. And that gets back to the role of the supervisor and making sure that they're actually communicating the policies as they are in writing rather than their own interpretation of how the job should be done, right? Well, let's move on. I'll see you just stop, but we'll move on to you again to ask you to answer the same question. So what do you think journalists should spend more time reporting on?
One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, I'm teaching a class this semester on police organization and public policy in the 21st century. And one of the things that we've been looking at is what is the role and function of police in society now? You know, how has it changed from the early days? We know you go back to the history of policing, you'll look at the slave patrols and the volunteer police, et cetera. But times have changed and society has changed so much. And now it's, as one police chief said to me, that we're suffering from mission creep, that everybody wants to dump everything on the police, that, okay, we don't have anybody else to do it. You know, it's like that commercial where they had Mikey will eat anything. And so it's like now that you just call the police, they'll do anything. And that's the problem I have now. I think we have overextended the police. We now expect them to be mental health specialists. We expect them to be sociologists. We expect them to be everything. And part of the blame I place here is legislators. That legislators keep introducing more and more legislation that's criminalizing so many things, that's causing police officers to do so many things that they have not been trained to do, or that they don't have time to do, or that we don't have money to pay them to do. And I think it's hurting the whole recruitment process because we training police officers to be police officers, but then they need to be social workers. They need to have the experts on homelessness because we have changed. We now have all these homeless people out there that were not there 50 years ago, and police officers are supposed to do something about it. We have all of these domestic violence cases now, and police officers are supposed to be able to handle that. As one older police officer told me, he said, well, when I came along, you know how we handle domestic violence cases? He said, we just separate them and maybe send the guy around, tell him stay away from the house for 30 minutes, cool off, and you won't want to hit her anymore. But, we've come a long ways from
very
that.
different now.
but we're having too many police officers who are killed in domestic violence situations. So, to me, we need to look at what role they're playing. And it also comes back to this whole defunding of the police, because I think the message that some people in the defund movement, they said it wrong, but they were saying that we need to look at the city budget, look at what we're spending on the police department, what we're spending on social services, and how it can be divided up. And so if we look at how we can change the role of the police where they're not responsible for everything, then maybe we can look at now, how do we go out and recruit for that?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Rosie, Chuck, thoughts on that?
Well, I have a lot of thoughts on that, and I agree with Elsie, but it's even broader of because our audience are the journalists of what they can actually do for us, is continue to tell the stories of what police are required to do and what police really should not be doing. Like, we are not the mental health professionals, but we have to deal with the mentally ill every single day. And, drug addiction, those type of calls. But if we could get more conversation going of why is police being required to do this? Why are there not more programs out there to redirect those issues? Because it's important to talk about when police are so overtasked right now, and we're having to deal with all these things that we're not experts. We're kind of having to deal with a whole variety every single day, and it takes such a toll on law enforcement. But I really think if the story was told of is police the right people to be dealing with mental health issues and drug addiction and homelessness, and that story should be told.
Mm-hmm.
I guess, am I on? Yeah, I guess,
Yeah.
I guess I take a different perspective. I've never been troubled by the fact that the police are asked to do a lot of things because, whenever something bad happens, people, what do? They call 911, right? They don't say, I have someone dealing with mental health issue. I think I'll call the Department of Public Services and see if I can get my brother who's thinking of committing suicide, see if I can get him an appointment this afternoon. They don't do that. They call 911. Now, some people could say they shouldn't call 911, but that's what they do. When anything ever bad happens, people call 911. So, you could argue that at that level, perhaps, you could have triage and you could have people like Tucson is doing. You have someone in the center that says, sounds like you have this kind of issue and we'll get you that. But the problem with a lot of the thinking on this is that these kind of issues don't happen at convenient times. They don't happen like 9 to 5. Oh, no, they happen at 3 o'clock in the morning when someone has decided they're not going to be on their medication anymore. And that this is a perfectly good time to tell people that they think they're going to take their life. So at 3 o'clock in the morning, when that mother is troubled by their kid who hasn't taken their medication and happens to have a weapon in the house, what does she do? Does she call the Department of Social Services at 3 o'clock in the morning? No. So however people want to frame this, people like to look at this and say, the police aren't the best ones. The answer shouldn't be, are the police the best ones? The question should be, what happens when that mother at 3 o'clock in the morning calls? Who's going to respond? And I believe, in, dual response and all of those things, that those are great ideas. And maybe that's going to happen in the next 3 to 5 years. But my money now is hire really good cops, train them really well, and then prepare them for dealing with these kind of situations. I always say this, my family is so tired of me saying this. I'm going to say it again. There's nothing better when you're in a crisis, there's nothing better than a good cop, and there's nothing worse than a bad cop. And I've seen good cops with people having mental health issues who are able to recognize persons in crisis, who are able to talk to them, and then are able to say, hey, here's someone you should see tomorrow afternoon who knows a lot more about this than me. But this whole notion that the problem with police is they're asked to do too many things is ridiculous. When there's a homeless person in Miami Beach at 3 o'clock in the morning and they're lying on the ground and they've been, they've overdosed, most people will say, oh, that's horrible, and walk over them. The cop will look at them and say, we got to get you some help. So this notion that police shouldn't deal with the homeless, the police shouldn't deal with people with mental health issues is just wonderful thinking. But no one has ever actually thought that we need someone to help that person at that moment, at a very inconvenient time.
So I have some thoughts about this, Elsie, if I could share, which is, I think it's a both and. And I feel like everything about police reform right now is more either or, either we fund the police more or we defund the police. Either the police do everything for everyone or we divert all of these things to others. And that's just not how the world works, and it's not how policing works. I mean, you can't just say, oh, we're going to have other people handle mental health issues and not continue to train officers in crisis intervention team training, because they're going to encounter people, to Chuck's point, in the course of just their routine patrolling. So it's really important, I think, that we find ways to all of your points to train officers, but also recognize that there aren't enough resources to serve all of society's ills and issues and problems. And then, time permitting, I'd love for us also to talk a little bit more about the 911 system and alternatives, because that has a big role to play in these ideas about diverting some share of calls and types of calls to other actors and entities. But it looks like, Rosie, you have something you want to share.
Yes. So in response to Chuck's comments, I just wanted to say, I'm not saying that, police should not be responding. What I'm saying is society needs to understand these are the calls that we're going on. We have to have a plan in place how we're going to deal with all those individual situations, because if we don't, police are still going to continue to respond. Now, we do train. We have a co-responding unit. But that is a hard thing to get funding for. So we have to concentrate on what is law enforcement going to do, what training we need, what resources we need, and at the same time, find those programs, find those alternatives to incarceration, but get that support on the back end to help us, because we know as police officers, we're going to be doing it for the next 20, 30, 50 years if we don't get our community to work in conjunction with what we're already doing.
Thanks. Elsie.
Yeah, I wanted to respond about the 911 system. That's the best education we have done in this country, I guess, is teaching everybody that there is a 911. So every little child knows to call, but they call for all the wrong reasons. You have a child that call to say, I want to some grocery or whatever. So we have everybody calling 911. So I think we need to look at how do we deal with that in terms of the 911 system. And then we also need to look at why other agencies don't work after 5. Why is it only the police, we're recruiting police officers and tell them they have to have a college education or whatever, and we make them work all hours. And so why don't mental health specialists? Why don't we have these teams working with the police? So that's the point I was making, is that we need to look at redefining the role of what everybody should be doing in society. And then how do we best address the issues of the 21st century with a new model of looking at how do police function as well as the social service agencies.
Yeah. I think Steve gave me permission to answer my own question, and it flows very nicely from this one, which is, I think that the journalists should spend more time looking at the 911 system and alternatives to 911. I say this, I feel like I need to admit, I wear another hat, which I'm a senior advisor on the Transform 911 project that's being run out of the University of Chicago's Health Lab. It's actually a convening that's running concurrent to this one. Sorry, Steve, don't want to detract people from this, but it's all being recorded. And they're really taking apart all aspects of the 911 system, looking at the people, the professionals who are answering the calls, how they're trained, how they go about triaging, what calls are coming in. It is absolutely true that people call 911 for everything, even in jurisdictions that have introduced 311, which is supposed to be the non-emergency alternative. You find that large shares of people who call 311, whatever the issue is, ends up meriting a police response, at least in the eyes of the people taking those calls, and vice versa. A very large share of calls to 911 are really non-emergency in nature. So a lot needs to be done to better understand and unpack these issues about why the public is calling 911 and what they really need. And the data are not very well accessible, but some of the recent analyses, particularly the work by Cynthia Lum and colleagues out of George Mason, suggests that a relatively small share of calls are at least coded as mental health related. But we keep talking about mental health issues and how they manifest and who's responding to them. So we need either better ways to classify calls coming in, or we need to recognize that a lot of calls are very uncertain in nature, and it's hard to assess the degree of risk that's involved to know whether it should be a police response or someone else.
If I can go back for a second, Nancy, with your permission, the premise of this panel was that even though nobody's really talking about defunding, and it's been pretty much taken out of the argument, taken out of the public debate, there's an awful lot going on in law enforcement around the country in some really interesting changes, approaches in strategy, in training. And PERF, for example, does a wonderful job in collecting a lot of stories that are going on around the country in many law enforcement agencies, whether it's in Utah or California or Illinois. And Chuck, I wonder if you could just go back a little over and tell us a little bit what you see as happening in the grassroots in law enforcement, that people are certainly seized with the idea that they can't keep going as they have been going. Things need to change. And maybe you can give our journalists and participants some sort of sense of what the landscape is now in terms of the approach to changes in law enforcement strategy and thinking and in grassroots training.
Well, I'm going to start, but I'm not smart enough to be able to answer that question, Steve. I don't know that. I think training is terrible. Okay, I just think the training that cops are getting is 25 years old. I mean, I think if you go into most academies, they're still training primarily the way they have. Not because they're doing a bad job, but because that has been the model that they've had. I think what we have seen in the past 5 years in policing, primarily because of body-worn cameras and videos, is the question of the defining issue in policing. Is someone coming on here? Let's see.
Hang on.
Okay. To me, if you've been looking at what's happened in policing in the last 5 years, it has been significant on all sorts of levels, questioning of the police in terms of how they patrol, how they do proactive policing, how they arrest someone, how they deal with someone in crisis. The Washington Post story of the 1,000 officer-involved shootings, if you disaggregate that and you look at that, and there's so much that has happened that has changed our thinking about policing. The problem is training is the last bastion of change. I always thought, my God, let's train cops differently. Well, turns out you just can't do that because you need the right people. I can tell you now this is completely self-serving as we're rolling out ICAT across the country, which has, and Nancy, you will appreciate this, and Elsie too, I'm sure, and Rosie, all of you, is when something has been tested in a randomized control study, you know what that is, right? You put one training to this group, another you don't do this, and then you have independent evaluations, all of the things that we want researchers to do, Kansas City study, preventive patrol study. That stuff doesn't happen as much anymore. We talk about evidence-based, everything should be evidence-based, but it's like that commercial. Where's the beef in evidence-based? Where is it? This particular study by the University of Cincinnati on de-escalation actually proved that you reduced use of force. Now think about that. What has been the issue in policing post George Floyd, Michael Brown, Ferguson, all of these cases? Use of force is the defining issue of policing and the reform movement. So if you have a strategy that actually reduces use of force, however, there are 18,000 police departments in this country. There's no national standards. There's no way. And yet, so implementing that and changing that is, because when we introduce this in some departments, the conventional thinking is we're already doing this. We should take that sentence, we're already doing this, and blow it up.
Always.
We're already doing this. And I think everybody in every profession likes to say that. Someone comes into your office and says, hey, have you ever thought of doing this? And you say, we're already doing that.
Yeah.
But the point of all of this, Steve, back to your question, then I'm going to shut up, is the training that the police are getting now is not preparing them for the challenges that they face. And I think it's got to, to me, I would, it has to be blown up and really rethink it. Because I don't think it's fair to the cops that are going out on the street today to hold them to one standard and to train them at a different standard.
So can I pick up on that one thing you said, and maybe have Elsie and Rosie come in on that about national standards? There is now talk, there's even a bill to that effect on the Hill about setting national standards, certainly for training, and in certification of police officers, in a number of different ways, strengthening the federal role, although we're not creating a federal police force by any stretch of the imagination. But is there an appetite, or do you think there should be, for a greater level, a greater national profile in training police and in developing some sort of standards for police activity, police behavior, and police actions? So
I'm going to let other people speak here. Go ahead, Elsie.
Well, I do want to say that since you're in constant discussion with cops and police chiefs around the country, when you get to that, if you tell us a little bit what they're thinking about.
Several panelists who can weigh in, and Elsie in
Right.
particular, given her expertise with training, might be able to share some with us.
I agree that Chuck would have a lot of information on that and probably more current than mine. But I agree that there's a need for some national standards. The question is whether there is a national appetite for this with all of the actions that's happening at the local level in state legislatures and so forth. So I don't see it happening right now from a political, where I sit now, I'm closer to working with state and federal legislators. I don't see the political appetite for that, but that doesn't mean that we should stop pushing for it and that journalists should stop writing stories about the need for it. And I think, since we're talking to journalists, if they could help to promote this more by writing more stories about it, that might, and as we talk about why we're having so many problems, that we don't have consistent training, we don't have consistent standards and policies across jurisdictions, that maybe we can get a movement going where there would be this appetite for that kind of change.
Yeah. And as Rosie knows, one of the recommendations of the Council on Criminal Justice's Task Force on Policing is to have national standards for training. And we recognize that the federal government can't impose any requirements on the 18,000 independent law enforcement state agencies in this country, but there are ways to incentivize issues around accreditation and certain training standards, and give resources and technical assistance to support the adoption of ICAT and other training, and hopefully effective training, or at least training that gets evaluated while it's implemented. Rosie, did you have anything to share on training? And then I know that you wanted to talk about officer wellness, and I don't want to lose that opportunity before we turn to questions from the audience.
On the training, when you ask the sheriffs or the chiefs from larger organizations, they want the national standards so they can help get funding for good training. But sometimes when you ask, say, a sheriff with from a rural county with only 9 deputies, they don't think they need that. And so we have to get law enforcement all on the same page, and that is our challenge out of those 18,000 departments. How do you do that, and how do you listen to every one of them at the same time? But I know Major Counties Sheriff's Association has been working on this for quite some time as well. And, like I said, the larger departments want it, the smaller probably don't yet, but we have to keep that conversation going, because that is where we are lacking, is training and funding for training. And when you have to pull out an officer off the road to train them, and we only have minimum of 40 hours a year, that's it. We do more, but that's all you're required to do. That's not enough training. That should be tripled. That should be more. Yeah. So, yeah. We're just putting people out there 40 hours of training, and then the academy as well. But that's such an important issue. I know Chuck's raising his hand.
No. I'm waiting for you. I'm waiting. I don't have to speak now.
Okay, I wanted to talk a little bit about officer wellness, because we have journalists here, how important officer wellness is, and having that conversation, because if we do not deal with that, we are putting people out on the street who are struggling themselves. And if those individuals are engaging with others, there's going to be some problems. And here's something the journalists can help, is help us talk about it. I did an op-ed in a newspaper, local newspaper, on officer wellness and what we're doing for our officers. And we wanted to talk about it, but when you look at the news article, the photo on the page was a gang member with his hands behind his back, handcuffed, with the title, "The Sheriff's Doing Things for Officer Wellness," but that didn't even match. So I would ask journalists, if you're going to help us tell the story, don't at the same time give a different perception, because that really ended up being more offensive, because that wasn't what we were trying to show, is somebody handcuffed behind their back. And there was even a caption, "Gang member handcuffed by sheriff's deputies." That's not what we were trying to do. We were trying to tell the story about why officers are important to our communities, and why officer wellness is important, and more police chiefs and sheriffs should get on board with that. We just recently had an incident last month, and it's still an open case, but we had an officer involved shooting where an individual shot a canine officer and killed it. That individual was a corrections officer. So police had to kill a police officer. That individual suffered from mental health issues. And we have to learn how to identify those, because they should not be working in law enforcement if it's so extreme. But at the same time, we have officers who are being treated for mental health issues, and they're doing a great job. So officer wellness is super important, and I'm very passionate about it, but we don't talk about it enough.
No, we really don't. And it stands to reason. I mean, officers are exposed to vicarious trauma routinely. And we know that from the research, right? I think there's a survey of officers found that I think had experienced a traumatic event in the past 6 months alone, right? And yet, because of the culture, that help seeking is not perhaps as common as it should be, and that trauma, when not treated, can carry over into their personal lives, their home lives, their work lives, and of course, how they interact with members of the community. So I think it does tie pretty directly back to issues around community force and use of force, and then community trust in police, which we haven't talked about much, although I do think journalists have covered that fairly well. Chuck, you had something you wanted to share?
Well, I did, and I apologize. I didn't mean to interrupt. Because that was such a good point that Rosie was making. But I was just going back to training for a second, then I'll get off of that to kind of answer Steve's question. One of the things I've learned about the whole issue, national standards, which I believe in. So in 2016, PERF came out with our guidelines on use of force. They were very controversial for reasons at the time we didn't understand, but we had the two major law enforcement groups on management and union side both came together, and they condemned our guidelines. And 5 years later, they're not controversial at all. The top 2 or 3 were duty to intervene, duty to render first aid, sanctity of human life. The controversial one was going beyond Graham versus Connor. But so what happened after that was they said, oh, well, what we need to do is we need to bring all the law enforcement groups together and agree on use of force standards after we came out with ours. And so they brought us all together. And what occurred to me then was establishing standards shouldn't be based upon, like a union agreement where you're trying to work out, well, you want this and we'll have this. And that's what it felt like. How do we compromise on use of force standards? In my mind, you do not compromise on standards. You say, like if you're talking about duty to intervene, you say it's duty to intervene. It's not, well, duty to intervene except in circumstances where such and such, so it becomes like legalistic, like a clause. No, you can't just say duty to intervene. And so what it said to me is that when you establish standards on use of force or training standards, and going back to something I know Nancy's very high on, evidence-based, or what is the right thing to do? It shouldn't be based upon a consensus of what groups think. It should be based upon what is the right thing to do, what makes sense. So I just kind of wanted to say that and go pick up on Rosie's point about the challenge in America. Why is America different from, say, the United Kingdom or Germany or some other countries that have national police? Because where you have national police, you can create standards. But in this country, what Rosie was saying was so right, is because, most 18,000 departments, probably 80% are 25 officers or less. So how those departments think versus the larger departments that have more of the resources, like Elsie, when she was head of training for the NYPD, she could tell you, she could incorporate the ABLE program, she could incorporate the ICAT program. So these small jurisdictions can't do that. And so, there's never been much appetite in this country for regionalization, which I think would go halfway there. In other words, why do we really need, in Washington, D.C., we have all of these different agencies. In Montgomery County, we have smaller agencies. So just kind of a cautionary thought about when we talk about these things, is there some middle ground? Is there some way to talk about consolidation? Do we really need all of this? So I'll shut up.
Yeah. Agreed, Chuck. And, we often look to national leadership on issues like this, but the states have been passing reforms that have been, pretty impressive and comprehensive. And I think the states have a much bigger potential role they can play in raising up training standards for all the agencies under their domain, and they have the authority to do that. Well, I'm looking at time. We've got just about a half an hour left. So I did want to just kind of run through some of these great questions that we're getting from members of the audience. And there's a couple, three that all touch upon the same issue, and it's our favorite topic. We've touched upon it a bit already, which is the unions. Well, what do we do about the unions? How do we get the unions on board? What do the unions think about training standards? Are the unions in favor of use of force training? Like how can we better engage with the unions so that they're partners rather than people who are obstructing reform? No one wants to take that on. I think, Chuck, you have to.
Well, see, look, PERF is a management organization. So, that doesn't mean we're anti-union just because we're management focused. We're not. And I've worked out some great deals. I don't mean deals, but agreements with the unions. I'll give you an example. If you look at how officers die in the line of duty, right? You look at that, you see a high percentage who are shot, but an even higher percentage who die in traffic accidents. And if you drill down in that, you see many of the officers who die in traffic accidents weren't wearing seatbelts. If you look at officers who were shot, and if they had worn body-worn armor, then they might have lived. So I thought, well, if we can make cops wear body-worn armor, which the National Institute of Justice has tested body-worn armor and so forth, and if we can make them wear seatbelts, we can cut injuries to officers. That to me seemed like a win-win kind of thing. So as we sat down with the FOP and so on, and it was a really good discussion. Their concern was if they weren't wearing a seatbelt, or body-worn, and they were killed, would their family still get benefits? I said, let's put a clause in that says no matter what happens, their family should get benefits. We came to agreement, the win-win. I also would try to do this on getting cops vaccinated. But there would be no appetite for that because more cops die of COVID than have been shot, stabbed, run over, but all of that. But your question really goes more to the whole reform issue. You see, I really think there's an opportunity here for unions because, if they're not engaged, if they're not involved, then they wind up, being on defense all the time, arguing against things. They should be talking about what are the things they think would make a difference. Look, for a good example is body-worn cameras. At first, unions really opposed them. And I remember we sat down with them as we wrote the guidelines for the Justice Department on body-worn cameras, and we sat down with them and talked to them about it and involved them. So I think there's opportunities.
Others on the topic of unions? I mean, I do think unions get demonized in ways that are really unfair, and that they serve an important role. But finding that common ground is often challenging when it comes to police reform. Let's look at some of these other questions we have here. Some more issues. Let's go this one. Tom McMorrow with Express News Group found that morale amongst law enforcement officers is just really at an all-time low. And he's wondering if that's something that others have observed and what the implications of low morale for officers have for police reform, for recruiting and retaining quality officers. And maybe I'll invite Rosie to speak first.
Yeah, I can speak on low morale, a lot of that has to do with the leader of the organization and how they are dealing with these things going around nationally. So if you're not supportive of law enforcement, because you can be supportive but recognize that there are issues, just like racism, you have to admit that that is going on and you're going to work on it, but you have to also at the same time let your officers know that you're there to improve what's going on with them in mind. And we're seeing that right now here in Utah, where Salt Lake City was hit with a lot of riots and protests, and the leadership and the mayor didn't come out and support law enforcement. Well, now they have such a huge challenge of hiring law enforcement, of getting officers to go out there and do proactive work. They're just backing up and doing, the calls at the very minimum. But other organizations, the police organizations that, said, yes, we understand there are problems, we're going to work on it. The morale is a little bit better. And it really comes down to who is the leader of that organization and what you're passing down. That is, to me, so important. What is your leader saying?
I'll just weigh in on this a minute. I think that one of the things the journalists could look at is low morale among workers in the United States. I'm finding low morale among students. So this pandemic of the last 2 years have really lowered the morale throughout the country. And I think we really need to look at it closely as it relates to police officers, because they have, they're out here working under certain circumstances. They have guns. So many of them are committing suicide. So I think that's a good topic for the journalists to look at, because I'm having a hard time being a college professor now, because young people they're just unhappy. They take everything so seriously and looking for me to give them answers to it. So, I would assume that as a police administrator, Rosie, you probably have a hard time, because so many people are looking for you to have all of these answers, and you don't have all the answers. You have 1,000 problems on your shoulder as an administrator. So every day I'm dealing with, trying to keep the morale of my students up, dealing with all the personal problems they're bringing, but a lot of it seemed to be directly related back to what's happening in the broader society, especially what has happened since the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks. Chuck, your organization has been tracking officer departures from agencies and issues around recruitment. I can only imagine that relates to morale to some degree. Can you share more?
Well, I guess on the morale issue, I've never been a fan of that as an indicator of how policing is doing. You hear cops will say, and Elsie and Rosie, I'm sure you can appreciate this, say, hey, morale has never been worse. Morale has never been worse. And then, that chief leaves and a new chief comes in, and then they start to like the old chief who used to be there.
Right.
And the chief they got now. They didn't think morale could be any worse till they got the new guy. Then they realized, morale is worse than it was before. It was actually good under this person. So I'm always not a big, but two things. So the survey that Nancy's talking about, if you look at the workforce like this, and you look at, people being recruited here and people in the department and then close to retirement, on all three ends of that workforce, right? People coming into the workforce declining, people resigning at a much higher percentage. Those are people who haven't reached the retirement age, or maybe they're 8 or 9 years in. They say, I don't want to spend 20 years here. They're getting out doing something different. And then people are retiring at an earlier, faster age. So the workforce is shrinking like this. You look at a place like Minneapolis, for example, which had 700 cops, and now it's down to probably around 500, which for a city the size of Minneapolis is significant. And a number of cops are out on medical leave, talk about PTSD, think about being a cop in Minneapolis and what that must be like. So, I think, there's issues there, but, if you look at again, I wouldn't measure a department on morale. Sometimes I find departments where the cops are working harder than anyone, and the morale is actually pretty high. So, it's all a function of the year. But the thing about morale today, I think what makes it different is, for example, if you ask cops today, would you want one of your kids to be a police officer? And Rosie, you tell me what you think. I walk into a room, I ask them that at whatever level, very few hands go up. What that tells me is they're unhappy and they don't want their kids to experience that. Am I correct, Rosie, in that assessment?
That has been in the past, but what we're seeing is a little bit turnaround now. Just my department alone, we just hired 2 individuals who their fathers are officers and they were referred by their fathers. So we're seeing that come back a little bit. Yeah. But for some time, it was like, there is no way I want my kid doing this job.
And in this new, actually, it's a really good point, because in this new survey we have coming out, we're seeing an increase in hiring. We are seeing an increase, but on the resignations, retirements, so forth. But think about this, for example, just think about this hypothetically. You're a cop and you've just watched this trial in Minneapolis where 3 cops have been convicted. And you're a quote unquote good working cop. And you're thinking there are cops in departments that have a reputation for using excessive force. And the department isn't very good at getting rid of them. And all of a sudden, one day, the partner who you've been working with, who you get along with and has your values, he's sick. So they put you with one of these cops who has a reputation for using excessive force. And now you are scared because you are now going to be drawn into whatever this other cop does who hasn't been held accountable. And not only could you lose your job, you could go to jail. I think that's how, the last 5 years is affecting the workforce. I think there's a concern, a trepidation that this job is really hard. And now you're being asked to not only do something about your own behavior, but other people's behavior when the department itself has not done anything about them, has not held them.
That's an interesting point. I wanted, we talk about morale, and maybe that's, I know you don't like that word, Chuck, or you don't like that notion so much, but there's another, I'm thinking from a research perspective, there's a lot of issues around organizational justice that affect morale. And what I mean by that is, are the rules fair? Are they applied the same to everybody? Do the people get promoted because they're the ones who worked hardest, who followed the rules the best? A lot of internal organizational equity issues that can affect morale as well. And there is some research to suggest that when perceptions of organizational justice are high, officers are more likely to apply with policies and practices and adhere to them, including duty to intervene. But when they're low, that does affect morale. So morale, I think, talking like a researcher, I think that these issues mediate through morale and manifest in not complying with rules and perhaps not dealing with members of the community in a particularly equitable manner either. Just a thought. Looking at time, first wanted to invite Elsie to share anything she might want to add on the issue of morale or related topics, as well as on recruitment, which we were also discussing.
I could add on recruitment, because as most of you know, I just completed a study for the COPS office. And we were looking at how to engage Black college students in 21st century law enforcement. And we spent some time with some students at 4 different colleges, but they were all, 3 of them were predominantly Black. one was predominantly minority, and just trying to get their ideas. And one of the things we spent a lot of time talking about was looking at recruitment and what would interest them in policing and why they wouldn't be interested in policing. And we found that most of them had had negative experiences with the police, at least one, or they had a family member, or they knew a friend who had had a negative experience with the police. And so we felt one of the things we came out of the study is that is a factor, but because so many had had negative experiences, we also asked them about positive experiences. And many more had had positive experiences than had had negative experiences. But we asked them why would they ever consider being a police officer? And surprisingly, about half of them said, they would consider it. They hadn't thought about it, but maybe they would consider it. But so what would make you interested? And the number one thing that would make them interested is service. They wanted to go in to see how they could serve their community. That would be the reason why they would want to be a police officer. In terms of some of the impediments, though, is that many of them talked about their family did not want them to be a police officer. And so that would be a hard thing for them, because if their family don't want them to be police officers, then they were less likely to rebel. Let me just tell this one story and then we move on. I had a student at the police academy in New York, a woman, and her family did not want her to be a police officer. Her father stole her training materials, so she would flunk the exam. And she came and reported her father because she really, really wanted to be a police officer. And, we had a talk with the father, and she stayed in the academy. But, that was like real dedication, somebody who really wanted to be a police officer, who thought she could make a difference. But many other people would have dropped out. They would not have gone on to become police officers because they are very much concerned about what their families think about policing. Yeah.
Another issue, and I know, Rosie, we've talked about this and your role on the task force, is just that, the entry-level workers in all manner of professions today are different. They're looking for different experiences. They tend to look for more flexible jobs. They might have things that in some agencies remain prohibited, like visible tattoos, or histories of illegal substance use that bar their eligibility. Can you speak a little bit to your experiences in trying to recruit new officers today?
Sure. One of the issues we're trying to do is change what the image of a law enforcement officer looks like, especially in the state of Utah, because the image is a male white, hair military style, and like I said, male. So it's not necessarily in people's mind that females can do this job, and we know they can. So we're trying to get to our communities and engaging and saying, look, we want to look like our communities who we serve. And one thing that we've had to take a look at is the challenge is the new generation that is out now. What is important to them is different than what was important 28 years ago when I started in law enforcement. So we are trying to figure out now, just an example, we are working on our policies for hair. How do you say, come and work for us, but you have to have, as a man, you have to have your hair cut short, military style, and you're African American. That's going to be a challenge just because of the hairstyle, the culture. And I'm using African American because I have an African American sergeant who brought it to my attention and said, you're asking me to do almost impossible things with my hair. Well, this is things that we hadn't, as an organization, took a look at, but we have to look at, gender-based policies, all different things involving our new generation that's coming out, because those are who we want to recruit. And it's becoming a huge challenge because we're not educated. But what we're doing is going out and getting educated, mostly by our communities. What do you want to see your police look like? And it's not just race, it's a whole broader, but it's a challenge right now. Yeah. And
Well, it gets back.
we're recruiting more females and more people of color. We went from 13% diversity to 26, and that's just in our jail. So we have a lot more work to do, but it's a huge challenge right now.
Yeah. And it gets down to even the job description, right? A lot of agencies use the same job description they've been using for years and years, and not adapting the description to the kind of officer you're trying to attract, right? And what you want to do is attract people with strong problem solving and people skills, right? Who want to help, to want to serve their communities, to Elsie's point. But I think that's pretty rare to see an advertisement for an entry-level law enforcement officer. I don't know, Jeff, maybe you've seen more of it than I have. I know you handle your own recruitment for chiefs, so you might be aware.
Yeah, I know that what we present in the public by media and our police departments are, come and join us. You can be a SWAT officer, you can be a gang officer. Right. Those kind of things. And now what we're redirecting is showing them how you can serve your community. And we're doing more stories on us engaging with kids and engaging in our communities. And we just have to change that direction. But before, it was easy to recruit because you just say, come and, doesn't everybody want to be a SWAT officer or a motor officer? And it's changing for sure.
I mean, you're absolutely right. We did a report on training and the use of force, or we call it re-engineering use of force and training. And we did a survey to break down the percentage of training on different aspects. And not unsurprisingly, Elsie, you'll appreciate this, the highest percentage was on firearms. And then, de-escalation and problem solving and all that was smaller. But and then we looked at ads, how are you recruiting? And they would, be like cops jumping out of helicopters, motorcycles, I got through watching the video. I wanted to do that. That sounds like fun, except it had nothing to do with, what policing is fundamentally all about. So how you promote the image and so forth. But you're right, Nancy, and about, the problem solving aspect. I mean, can you imagine videos made about problem solving and community policing? And, I mean, that's the disconnect. The very people who you want to be cops, really, aren't. You can't capture their imagination. You can't get them. I mean, if we want to change policing, we need to figure out how we get a larger group of people engaged who normally wouldn't be engaged. And that hasn't really fundamentally changed. There was a push way back when, you remember Elsie, police corps, right? Adam Walensky and so forth. And, that was a really, intuitively, that was a great idea, but it really didn't help. But, how do we get people to say, if you really want to make a difference in people's lives, if you really want to, engage with communities that are, really struggling, this is a great job. That's why I go back to this notion of, the police are doing too much. I get on one level, but on the other level, helping a homeless person, helping someone, get into an addiction program who's addicted, calling up a parent whose son has been missing in San Francisco and they're from Boston, and getting them on the phone, getting that parent on the phone, say, hey, I found your son. He's here in San Francisco and he wants to go home. Can we fly him home? To me, that's what the noble parts of policing are all about. Those are the stories. If we got journalists, I'd love to see journalists, kind of capture that side of the good cop, if you will.
Mm-hmm. So we have, I'm going to take one more question and then we're going to do a lightning round. So I'm going to tell you what the lightning round is now so you can have it in your head. And it's just got to do it in like 1 minute or less. And it can be something we covered already, but ideally it's not, whichever you like. If you could do just one thing to promote police accountability, what would it be? Okay, hold that thought. I'm gonna go Elsie, Chuck, Rosie in that order. But there is one question here about screening of officer candidates. So we talked about recruitment, but we didn't talk about screening. And we probably have an opportunity for one person to respond to that. Maybe Rosie, you could, what you know about how to screen for the types of people that you would make for good cops, as well as for those who are ill-suited dispositionally, or for just kind of signing up for the wrong reasons.
Right, and there's a lot of screening that goes on in law enforcement, but here's the problem. We all do it different. We're not on the same page, so we're not all screening the same way. Somebody can qualify in one police department, and there's another police department who would have said, absolutely not, you are not going to qualify here. But what we do is we do intensive interviews and background interviews, psychological tests. There's a lot that goes into it, but at the same time, I'm telling you, we're not on the same page. And that's part of the problem. We have to figure out how do you identify the best people for this profession and not lower that standard.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Elsie?
One of the things that we got from our study, that many of the young people felt like there were too many absolutes in the screening process, and there should be more room for judgment as to whether a person could be a good police officer if they had bad credit, if they had smoked marijuana. Marijuana was the biggest discussion that we had, that they just felt like police departments were stuck. Many police departments were stuck on that. And they said, and the problem is because you got different marijuana laws throughout the country. And so you might grow up in one state, and then you go to apply for a police officer in another state. You grew up in a state where it was legal, and now you're being penalized. You can't become a police officer because you had followed the law in your state, and now you're being told, oh no, but that's not the state where you're trying to work.
Right. Yeah, I know a lot of agencies are wrestling with that issue right now. Well, let's turn to our lightning round. So Elsie, we'll start with you. If you could do one thing and one thing only to promote police accountability, what would you do?
Oh, wow. One thing. I guess, wow, this is hard. I think of one thing because there are so many things.
There's so many things, and they're all interconnected, aren't they?
Yeah.
I mean, this hard for a reason.
Well, one thing may be in terms of weeding out bad cops, having the early warning system and sticking to that, so that good cops can see that you are holding people accountable.
Mm-hmm. I guess decertification is tied to that, and to some degree. We didn't cover that, but that's certainly a big issue. Thanks. Chuck, one thing, what would it be?
Hire the right people. And let me just to say why I think that's important. I can give people training, but I can't change their character.
Mm-hmm.
So the character comes to me, and if they are someone who doesn't know the difference between right and wrong, doesn't know how to communicate, doesn't know how to treat people in a humanistic way, doesn't know how to talk to people. So I'm more interested in the front end, because as you all know, here in Washington, D.C., for example, and this happened in Miami too, there was like one class, I think it was 1989, they just hired all of these people they shouldn't have hired, and they paid for it for the next 20 years. So anyhow, if you want to change policing, look at the front end as to the kind of people you can hire. How can you get the best people? How can you get people of good character?
Yeah. Get the right people on the bus, right, Chuck?
Jim
He's
Collins.
spoken about that before. Yeah, it's true though, right? Rosie, if you could do one thing to enhance police accountability, what would it be?
I think I agree with everybody that's already said what they've said, and that's important. I think that we need to look at evidence-based through data to see what we can do to make true change, because right now, law enforcement, we can't afford to collect our own data, but we have to fund programs to collect the data, look at it fairly, and then make the decisions. We're just reacting too quick without looking at enough data. And, you know, that's just one of them. There's a whole bunch, and I agree with both of them. We have to hire the right people.
Yeah. Rosie, I was smiling because I was going to give myself the last word and say what I thought the one thing should be.
Oh.
And surprise, surprise, it was around data. As a researcher, sure, but I think data transparency can really increase accountability. And the more that data are shared with the public and with journalists, members of the media, the more everybody knows what's what and where we are. And, I think a lot of agencies maybe feel like that just makes them vulnerable to scrutiny, but we also don't know enough about what agencies are doing things exceptionally well because of a lack of data transparency. So it is at the top of the hour. So I think we're done with this session. Steve, do you have any way you'd like to close us out?
This was great. I just wanted to mention we have a lot of questions. I think most of them were answered, but those that weren't, I'm going to send around to our panelists. And if they want, they can answer them at their leisure time, and we'll send the answers back to you guys. We've also been posting in the chat room, as I hope you've noticed, different URLs to some of the studies that we'll be talking about, and including a story, an op-ed that Elsie did for the crime report, which is quite fascinating, about a survey that she also mentioned about her African-American students and their changing, evolving interest in law enforcement careers. And I recommend that for everyone's reading. It's certainly a really worthwhile story. But I want to thank everybody. We try to cover a lot of ground in this one. When we talk, we just leave defunding out of the picture. There's so much else to talk about. We'll have another chance later on this afternoon, another kick at the can in terms of diversity in police hiring. We'll have a conversation with Shaitira Gaston of the University of Georgia, who wrote a really good study on the impact of diversity in police forces and police misconduct. So I recommend you stay on for that. It'll be really interesting. But we'll have a little bit of a longer break, give people time to stand up, have a bite to eat, and walk around a bit before we resume. So it's about a half hour or so, and we'll come back about 12:30, and we'll talk about mental illness and the justice system. So thank you all. Thanks especially to Nancy for doing a great job in moderating, and to all of you for your time. I heard back from Dallas, incidentally, and Chief Anderson, although he had said he was going to make it, couldn't make it at the last moment because something else came up. So we had to do without the voice, the all-important voice from Dallas to this one, but we'll do that perhaps next year or next time. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Rosie, Elsie, Chuck.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.